The idea of major groups, 9 major groups, and this is a concept you must understand and ally with. And finally, it articulated very clearly the Convention on Biodiversity and the Convention to Combat Desertification in the left-hand corner. Next slide. Who's moving the slides? Yeah. So achieving the SDGs is important in tackling climate change and linking with climate change. And it is identified by some, not everybody agrees on this, but the climate change impacts are the single biggest threat to the SDGs. And they certainly disproportionately burden the poorest and most vulnerable. So halting climate change, we need to look at a sustainable, low carbon, resilient development. And this is the underlying goal of the SDGs. We need to strengthen countries to adapt to climate change better, reduce greenhouse gases, and we need financial and technical support. Building on the UNFCCC adopted in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, the new phase was launched in Paris in 2015. And you can see that this has increased ambition and a new way of implementation. Next slide. Next slide, please. 3 UN conventions were adopted at Rio. We've already talked about UNFCCC, which entered into force on 21st March 1994. 197 countries ratified and became party to the convention. And a secretariat was set up first elsewhere and later moved to Bonn in 1990. It's set up in 1996 and moved to Bonn later. The other 2 conventions are also going in parallel, and these 3 conventions are the Rio Convention, which are very important. Next slide. There was a series of initiatives launched by WMO and UNEP in assessing the state of the environment in particular, but more focused on the global climate. And it detected in the second assessment report a discernible human influence, negative influence on global climate, and articulated the need for no regrets options and cost-effective strategies to combat climate change. July 2001, the COP6, and you'll hear more about the COPs later, clearly enunciated that climate has changed both globally and regionally, and actually later in more detail, even locally. And warming has observed over the last 50 years, all attributable to human activities. The 4th assessment report in 2007 talked about the clarity that there was warming of the climate system, increases in global average air and ocean temperatures, widespread snow and ice melt, and sea level rise. And these impacts are going to likely increase. And it talked about anthropogenic warming, extreme weather events, sea level rise, which will continue for centuries, even if we reduce GHGs. Next slide. And I've flagged some of the reports. Please attempt to read them. The 5th IPCC in 2014 once again talked about some of the irreversible changes that have taken place and recognized that heat waves occur more often, extreme precipitation happens more intensely and frequently in many regions, and we need to tackle each of them so that we minimize risk and avoid amplifying existing risks and creating new ones. So implementing mitigation and adaptation can help us create future pathways for sustainable development. And you can see that 2014 itself, there was an articulation by the climate change people about its links to sustainable development. The 6th assessment report, I'm not going to talk about, but I would like to thrash out a few concepts. No, that took place last year. It's important to read it. I encourage you to read it. We need to get our concepts right, and we need to understand what parties are doing and promote action which is urgently needed on each of these elements: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, global stocktake, climate finance, and the other four, which I'll talk about. Next slide. So mitigation is central to the intergovernmental negotiations. And at times people have blamed us in saying we focus too much on mitigation, but mitigation is needed to decrease emission release to the atmosphere and reduce the current CO2 concentration. One way is by enhancing sinks. We recognize the implementation of programs, policies, investments, and incentivizing of clean actions, the disincentivizing of large greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to recognize these various sectors: energy generation, use, transport, buildings, industry, agriculture, forestry, land use and waste management, which need to be well designed so that we minimize energy use. We need to increase renewable energy use. So some examples I've cited here: electric cars, change practices, drive less, change one's diet, eat simpler food, expand forests, help create sinks, remove greater amounts of atmospheric CO2, and improve simple things like a cooking stove design. And so, even countries which have developmental challenges can help contribute to tackling some of the problems. We need to hold global temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursue limiting it even further. And only then can we significantly reduce climate change risks and impacts. And even now, we have not yet fully agreed to 1.5 degrees. Developed countries have set economy-wide 2020 emission targets, but 2020 has come and gone, and these targets have not been achieved. Developing countries have identified nationally appropriate mitigation action, but have been challenged both by resources as well as by implementation capacities within the country. The Paris Agreement set nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, to be articulated by each individual country, and this is a key way of moving ahead. Industrialized countries set economy-wise caps for national emissions, meet binding emission reduction targets through domestic mitigation measures, and some of the modalities for implementation should address land use change, better forestry, using market-based mechanisms. We also need to look at specific needs of developing countries arising from impacts, both of disasters, other events, as well as response actions, and minimize the adverse economic, social, and environmental impact on others. And you can see here the approach to climate change mitigation. Building adaptation was initially resisted because we thought we had to fight climate change. But we now realize that we need to deal with existing climate change impacts and prepare for future impacts to protect people, livelihoods, and ecosystems. And we must moderate potential damage and benefit from opportunities. There is no one-size-fits-all for everybody, but we need to focus on the needs of community, business, organizations, countries, regions. And these could range from, and I've listed a few here: flood defenses, cyclone early warning systems, cyclone shelters, drought-resistant crops, redesigning communication systems, business operation, government policies. We need to build resilient nations, and we need to have greater ambition to manage risk both now and in the future. Adaptation actions should be country-driven, transparent, gendered, participatory, ensure engage vulnerable groups, and be guided by best available science and traditional knowledge of indigenous and local people. we need to establish, and this has been done now, national adaptation programs of action and plans, the so-called NAPs. Here you can see this, and I would urge you to take a photograph if you've got cameras, but otherwise I can send you a copy of this. So this looks at the adaptation process and the need to raise awareness, ambition, political engagement, share information, strengthen national and local institutional capacities, get financial and technical support, and engage with, consult, and help partner with a wide range of stakeholders, including the private sector. Next slide. There's some studies done on what are the things that have been done, both by developed and developing countries. So 129 of the 154 developing countries have done more than one activity to formulate, and even some have begun to implement the NAPs. 21 LDCs accessed funding to do NAPs. 13 have pipeline proposals under the GCF, Readiness and Preparatory Support Program. 26 NAPs are available publicly, 7 of them from LDCs. 13 are seeking approval, and 16 of the 32 are being acted upon. The proposals are being acted upon. Most country NAPs align adaptation actions with the 2030 agenda. Countries must ensure that both indigenous people and local communities meaningfully engage and get well integrated into the process to formulate and implement NAPs, including by women. And here you can see visually how to do mitigation and adaptation. And later look at this particular image. Loss and damage, this is the key. It has come out from the last few COPs, and in Warsaw, we enacted an international mechanism to deal with loss and damage, a vehicle to avert, minimize, and address. This is a diplomatic word, but compensate for countries that have been feeling the impact of loss and damage due to climate change through no fault of theirs, but by actions taken by others. Expert groups have been created, one on extreme weather events, one on slow onset events like drought, famine, non-economic losses, displacement by climate change's adverse impacts, a group on comprehensive risk management, and another group talking about transformational approaches. Fiji, which hosted a COP in COP23, launched a clearinghouse for risk transfer, and it catalyzes action by non-state actors, including the industry, for insurance and the private sector, connecting those seeking assistance with solution providers. And you can see from this image the kind of activities that are to be taken. There is a crucial Article 14 of the Paris Agreement, which agrees to periodically take stock of implementation, assess progress, not just towards to what is planned, but also to the Paris Agreement's long-term goals. This will be conducted by CMA, and the coverage is mentioned, both in terms of equity and the best available science. This is the year for the first GST, and there's a fair amount of multiple views, but hopefully this will get resolved, and COP28 will help us grapple with and understand what the global stocktake shows and the need to improve and accelerate action. One will be held every 5 years thereafter. Its outcome is to inform and enhance, in a nationally determined manner, actions to be taken in accordance with the Paris Agreement and international action. Next slide. Climate finance is recognized as important, and developed countries are obliged to mobilize climate finance. from a variety of sources, instruments and channels, including public funds. We also encourage voluntary contributions by other parties, support country-driven strategies to address developing country needs and priorities, well beyond previous efforts because they are inadequate. A standing committee on finance has identified the need to improve cohesion and coherence, coordination and coherence, rationalize the UNFCCC's finance mechanisms. There are 4 of them, which you'll see. Mobilize financial resources for financing and measure, report, and verify the support that has been provided to developing countries. We need to do more and we need to act faster. The financial mechanisms are listed here, and you may be astounded as I am by the names, but they're all important. The GEF, the GCF, the LDCF, and the Adaptation Fund. And there is a target set that prior to 2025, the Paris Agreement has identified a new collective goal at 100 billion per year as a minimum, a floor, and much more to be mobilized. And we are far from achieving it. Next slide. So finance is important. Some of the other issues identified are technology development and transfer, both climate technologies, renewable wind energy, solar and hydropower technologies, soft technologies, energy efficiency, use of equipment, training for stakeholder engagement, and gender. So the LDC expert group, the adaptation committee, the LDC portal can all help us identify actions. It's important to note the thought about women, and not just the thought, but the clear articulation that while women are vulnerable groups to climate change impacts, they can benefit from adaptation and they have greater potential to act as agents of change. Implicitly, it's a comment on the current gender relations. We need to engage, and there's a platform created to see that local communities and indigenous people do a series of steps and adopt holistic integrated best practice, some of which they're already doing. And we need to learn from it. And finally, capacity building support clearly identified both for developing countries and economies in transition, and a series of steps to be addressed on awareness raising, education activities, and CC integration. Some of them have started in school curriculum. Next slide. We now move to the next phase of the presentation, which is to look at the UNFCCC Conference of Parties. The so-called COPs are not policemen, but Conference of Parties. And the first most important one was COP3, which created the Kyoto Protocol, which 192 countries have ratified. And we have already gone through 2 periods of activity. COP7 in Marrakesh, that's in Morocco, detailed the rules of implementation, set up new funding, adaptation planning instruments, and a technology transfer framework. KP entered into force in 2005 at COP11, and COP12 in Kenya launched the Nairobi Work Program on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation, as well as identified improvements in projects for the clean development mechanism. Next slide. COP13 and 14, that's in Indonesia and Poland, were dominated by KP successor negotiations. But national reduction targets for 2020 were identified and were to be submitted by mid-February of 2009. COP15 in Copenhagen was ambitious in attempting to reduce CO2 emissions, but unfortunately could not be passed unanimously. Mexico's COP16 created a Cancun adaptation framework asked for 100 billion per annum per year for the Green Climate Fund, and created a climate technology center and network. COP17 in South Africa, the African COP, created the Durban Accord, which was a draft of a legally binding strategy on global warming to be passed by 2015. And that's what moved ahead to Paris. Next slide. Qatar's COP18 produced the Doha Climate Gateway, an amendment to the Kyoto Protocol with a further commitment period up to 2020, and targeted 15% global CO2 emissions, and standardized some language on loss and damage. And this may appear silly and unimportant, but actually it's hard negotiation at each of the COPs. And we'll talk about it a little later, and somebody can ask me a question on the different approaches used by the SDGs and by climate, and which is better. COP19 in Poland adopted the Warsaw Framework and coined the term intended nationally determined contribution, and created the Warsaw International Mechanism to provide aid and expertise to cope with loss and damage from heat waves, droughts, floods, and rising sea level, as well as desertification. Peru created the Lima Accord to cut back GHG emissions, but there was some hesitations, understandably so, identified, and there was a recognition that while a global climate treaty is important, it's just one outcome. Real change will take place from the grassroots, and let's see how to make that happen. Next slide. Next slide. We come to Paris. So this was a bold landmark agreement. It could have been passed 4 years ago in Copenhagen, but it got pushed forward to Paris. And I must say the French negotiated hard and strong, and they helped pull people together. It reorients the global efforts to combat climate change, and accelerates both action, but more importantly, investments for a sustainable low carbon future. Its entry into force target was 55 countries, accounting for at least 55% of global emission. And it happened faster than expected. It targeted global temperature rise at certain levels, which are mentioned there. It recognized that countries will define their own nationally determined contributions, and appropriate financial flows should come before 2025. And it put the need to accelerate a goal on finance provision beyond the US 100 billion floor, which I've said is not yet been achieved. It enhanced capacity building and transparent framework on climate change impacts and the need for adaptation. Next slide. It created a new global adaptation goal, that's Article 7, and did some plans for adaptation through national adaptation plans, vulnerability assessments, monitoring and evaluation, economic diversification, and the recording of actions needed in a public registry, which is publicly available, preferably on the web. It identified a way to periodically stock take what was happening to the implementation. And you can see this first global stock take I've already mentioned. It will take place in 2023. Next slide. What has happened after Paris? Paris Agreement, PA, was ratified by 111 countries, covering 3/4 of global emissions. So it came into force earlier than expected, which is good. It created the Marrakech Action Proclamation by His Majesty It identified that the Paris Agreement was being served by the Adaptation Fund. It drew up a roadmap for mobilizing the 100 million a year, not yet achieved, unfortunately. It reviewed the Warsaw International Mechanism and created new alliances, the Pathway Platform 2050 and Powering Past Coal Alliance launched. These are alliances of countries and organizations. Fiji, the first South Pacific to host a COP, took a unique approach by convening the Talanoa facilitative dialogues, and we'll talk about that. It also introduced the IPCC special report on global warming, pushing for 1.5 degrees change, and renewed the push by developing countries for strong action by 2020. Next slide. This is important, and I want to focus a little bit on it. The Talanoa dialogues is building on a Pacific tradition. It is not negotiated hard instruments. It is coming together to talk in a new form. And even if there is no formal agreement, there is consensus. So a non-confrontational approach using storytelling, solution-oriented, where parties and stakeholders provided input. And in the second phase, ministers engaged in high-level roundtables in Poland. It identified, and I want to read this out because the emphasis is important. Climate action is on the rise, but not at a speed and scale we need. We need to do more, and we need to do it now. We must have a just transformation for a better world, unlock technology, act boldly and together, maintaining climate at the top of the political agenda, work with so-called non-party stakeholders to achieve this ambition. Government agencies must step up action. Private sector leaders must become change drivers. Civil society leaders must marshal public and political will to drive action. Spiritual leaders should unlock spiritual pathways to address climate change. The world youth were called to mobilize at a larger scale to ensure their future was secure. And it called on everybody to take forward a clear signal from the Talanoa dialogues. For me, this particular set of actions is probably more important, even though there was no formal sign-off, there was consensus being built, and we need to take this forward. Next slide. Next slide. We are so impressed. One sec. So COP24 in Poland created the Katowice rulebook. It enunciated the need for nationally determined contributions. It called to take forward the Talanoa dialogue. And there was a ministerial declaration on energy, declarations on energy, forest, and electric mobility, a launch of the Forest for Climate, a Silesia Declaration for Just Transition, a high ambition coalition, information needed for clarity, transparency, and understanding, and a series of actions to promote transparency, accuracy, completeness, comparability, and consistency in the submissions by parties. It called for voluntary cooperation to implement NDCs, including market-based approaches, and a series of actions at the national level. Biennial transparency reports as appropriate to add information on implementation. Next slide. Before we go to COP25, in November 2019, the last time the world met, it talked of climate action at the summit level. So there were 9 summit tracks, and they're listed here: mitigation, social and political drivers, youth, energy transition, industry transition, nature-based solutions, infrastructure, cities, and local action, building of resilience and adaptation, linking the two, and more effective climate finance and carbon pricing. 70 countries announced plans to enhance national contribution. 65 countries committed to net zero emissions by 2050. And several states and groups of states, SIDS, LDCs, major cities, regional economies, private and financial sectors came forward with initiatives. Next slide. Here again, I'm going to read this out because it's a very moving statement by the UN Secretary General. We stand at a crucial juncture in our collective efforts to limit dangerous global heating. We will have to be on one of two paths. One is the path of surrender, where we have sleepwalked past the point of no return, jeopardizing the health and safety of everyone on this planet. Do we really want to be the generation that is remembered as the generation that buried its head in the sand, fiddled while the planet burned? The other option is the path of hope. And this is what he called for, a path of resolve, of sustainable solutions, where more fossil fuels remain where they should be in the ground, and where we are on our way to carbon neutrality by 2050. That's the only way to limit global temperature rise to the needed 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. And that's probably a dangerous path itself, but it's the kind of mobilization that is needed. Next slide. Next slide. COP25, which was supposed to be held in Chile, was relocated to Madrid, but called for certain things: ambition to defeat the climate emergency, work on capacity building, deforestation, indigenous people, cities, finance and technology were debated, discussed and operationalized. A gender action plan was adopted, and the Climate Ambition Alliance expanded. Global Climate Action Awards were given to 15 most practical, scalable and respective sectors, not at the national level, but at the sectoral level. Respective sectors, not at the national level, but at the sectoral level. Glasgow, Scotland was a year late because of the global pandemic, but it certainly launched new partnerships, new funding, and reshaped certain sectors at scale to demand a net zero future. The World Leaders Summit adopted the Glasgow Climate Pact and identified a number of areas. They're all listed here. Please read them carefully. It talked about the need to halt and reverse forest loss, align the financial sector with the net zero targets, ditch the internal combustion engine, accelerate coal phase out, and end international fossil fuel finance. Not necessarily with dates and times, but certainly calling for high ambition. A global goal for adaptation was enunciated to achieve steep change in finance, doubling current funding, and stressing the reality of loss and damage from climate change. The Santiago network was operationalized. 151 parties submitted updated NDCs. 8 more were to do so. 42 countries targeted coal phase-out dates and called for international public finance for coal to be ended. All regions adopted the so-called breakthrough agenda, which was a 10-year plan to create green jobs and growth and make clean tech affordable and accessible by 2030, and identified certain sectors to be targeted: power, road transport, steel, hydrogen, and agriculture. Next slide. Here are some images, and I urge you to spend a minute on them. Look at the target of forestry, which is aimed at. We need to tackle floods, identified at the bottom, through a climate justice alliance, using the backs of the turtles, demanding for climate change, talking about food targets, identifying one last chance in COP26, looking at solar power and identifying both how to tackle drought and how to work in the Mediterranean. And I urge you to reflect on these images and showcase them, publicize them, because they are important. Next slide. Sherman Sheikh, which is the country where I currently live, adopted the Sherman Sheikh Implementation Plan, SHIP, established a historic loss and damage fund to save livelihoods from climate disasters. It agreed on guiding the global goal on adaptation, delivery, and tracking progress. It talked of regionalization of climate action, accelerating renewable energy rollout, creating a two-tier carbon market, applying rules for who buys credits and for what purpose, scaling up and simplifying access to finance, and making sure that we have increased climate ambition in several sectors, including water, food, agriculture, tackle poverty, broaden our donor base, target the most vulnerable developing countries, and take strong action to reduce ambition. I was there personally. It's the first COP I attended, and I can tell you that I was moved to see the volume and numbers of people from all over the world gathered. I was a bit overwhelmed, in fact, by the significance of the assembly, and I am still grappling with how to make it even better in the future. Next slide. I stopped talking for a minute on climate change, but we need to come back to it by moving to sustainable development. And as you can see, number 13 of the SDGs is on climate action. So the two are well linked. The Millennium Development Goals did not talk about climate, but it's Rio Plus 20 which reoriented and called for sustainable development and identified SDG 13. Next slide. So we have 17 Millennium Development Goals. And I must say, wait. We are first of all talking about the MDGs. So I'm not going to read out these MDGs, but you need to go back and look at them. These were focused on developing countries. They were important, but not universal. Next slide. The Rio Plus 20, while committing to the MDGs, called for a new set of SDGs based on Agenda 21. The future we choose, and you must read this, is what elders, Nobel laureates, and HLP members put in their declaration. In this Anthropocene era, humankind is the dominant driver of geological change on Earth, forcing all activity to be judged against social and economic boundaries. We need to create a safe operating space for humanity. We need to find out how to do this. Interestingly enough, governments, NGOs, major groups, companies, universities made voluntary agreements, and governments invested in only 50 of the 692 commitments. So it's important that other players be mobilized and committed to what they have committed to. The future we have not yet imagined is a document which the major group on youth and children created, and you need to read this, and I'm going to read it out aloud. We came here to celebrate our generation. We danced, dreamt, and loved on the streets of Rio, and found something to believe in. Unfortunately, you have not chosen to celebrate with us. And the youth made a very pungent and potent call to achieve the future we want. Next slide. So, parallelly to the Rio process, the SG created, Ban Ki-moon, established a 27-member high-level panel, Sherpas and a secretariat, who created a new, bold articulation and report, new global partnerships, eradicating poverty and transforming economies through sustainable development. It talked of 5 transformational shifts, ending extreme poverty, integrating SDGs at the core of post-2015, transforming economies for jobs and inclusive growth, accountability and peace, and forging new partnerships based on equity and mutual accountability. It talked of and it established the SDGs not only for developing countries, but a universal agenda, and made it the prerogative of each country to tackle both good governance, accountability to their people, honest, responsive state institutions, in addition to delivery on health, education, water, and basic needs, and called for partnerships to help implement and monitor commitments. And you can read that report. So what is the 2030 agenda, the so-called Rio agenda? It's a shared blueprint of calls for action in 5 areas: peace, prosperity for people to end inequalities within and among countries. So not just across countries, but within countries as well. For a planet to be sustainable through a global partnership well into the future. These 17 SDGs have 169 targets, and there are also subsequently indicators developed, and they are to be implemented by all. No one will be left behind. We need to reach the furthest behind first. So SDGs go far beyond MDGs and call for a number of things, including more peaceful and inclusive societies. And you can see I've put SDG 16 at the corner, but it's crucial. It's the base for all the other SDGs. And you can see it up there as well. The peace dove as a basis for achieving sustainable development. Next slide. Next slide. I'm not going to read out the SDGs except to mention poverty being ended, hunger being ended, goal 2, health, SDG 3, inclusive high quality education for all, 4, gender equality and empowerment, 5, availability of water and sanitation, access to affordable energy for all, goal 7, SDG 8, sustained, inclusive and economic growth, and decent work for all. Next slide. Goal 9, important for us, resilient infrastructure. This is the goal of various things of people who are talking about resilience. Inclusive and sustainable industrialization and innovation. Inequality within and among countries, eliminating them. Making cities safe, resilient, and sustainable. Ensuring sustainable consumption and production. Reducing what we consume. Combating climate change, SDG 13. Using the oceans and seas, SDG 14. Land use, SDG 15. And I've already talked of 16. 17 is the means of implementation and a revitalization of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. And you need to read these carefully again and again and get involved in them, advocate them, buy a badge and wear it proudly and educate people about it. And how will we implement? And I think we are coming to the end of my presentation, so you can throw questions at me or formulate questions. But we cannot achieve SDGs, and now particularly with COVID, we have been set back, so we need to accelerate action without intensive global engagement. We need a revitalized global partnership, ambitious and now even more ambitious means of implementation, and all partners working together, including voluntary actions. SDGs must help the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. There is money to be mobilized domestically from public resources, from private business, both domestic and international, from international development cooperation, international trade for the SDGs, reducing debt and tackling debt sustainability, including eliminating it, and tackling systemic issues. We need cohesive, nationally owned SDG strategies, and you will find most countries in the world have created them. Please get educated on what Nepal has done. I know of some of the things both on climate change and SDGs which it has done, and I haven't put it as part of the presentation, but I can share it with you. Whoever does not have this information, you can probably access it internally as well, and you need to read them. Domestic resources must be mobilized and supported by an enabling international environment, world trade, which is coherent and mutually supporting, and good global economic governance. If we are to achieve the SDGs at all levels consistently, we need sustained action by all, a reinvigorated global SDG partnership, pursuing policy coherence, and achieving the SDGs. And my last slide. What must we do now to link CC and SDGs? This is something I haven't prepared in detail, but we need to, go back to that. We need to focus on both sustainable development and one of its elements, which is climate change. And you will see that under the SDG agenda, there are 4 or 5 goals focusing on the environment. There is one goal, a key goal, focusing on peace, and we need to link them all. They have been framed by countries rather than UN agencies, and we need to believe in them and act on them and strengthen them and strengthen their implementation. So that's all I have to say. I don't know how long I've spoken, probably too long, but I am available for answering, not just answering questions, but listening to views that you have and tackling what needs to be tackled. Thank you.
Thank you, Loy. That was an amazing sort of an excursion to the development or the history of development of both the concept on climate change and the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goal. You did wonderfully well. I mean, you explained the concepts as well as the problems therein, and I like very much the way you presented the loss and damage concept and the kind of climate financing, and your elaborate discussion on Sustainable Development Goal. So now the floor is open for Q&A. Please identify yourself, raise your hands, or just fight for your speech. And then Loy will be there to answer your queries. The floor is open.
I will respond.
Oh, yes.
I don't know if I can answer it effectively, but
yes.
I can certainly encourage you to continue to discuss and act together in the country and in the region and contribute to the world dialogue and action. Yeah.
Good. Yes, anybody, please help me to identify if somebody has any question. And please raise your hand. There is a system of raising hands, and also you can do like this. Just to warm it up, if there are no questions, I was just wondering, Loy, if you can, and considering say Nepal has done rather comfortably well in several of the indicators for SDGs. You didn't talk about the indicators much on the SDGs as well as on the climate change adaptation. Now, as SDGs, Nepal has done one very well as compared to others. Not very well, but as compared to well. But when it comes to the climate change adaptation, I mean, it is, I must say that we are not very strong. Professional-wise, even among the professionals, it is not a very active agenda. Now, could you please cite some success story of climate change adaptation? Is there any guideline on an individual basis? For example, I want to do something for climate. I know that I'm creating bad atmosphere or by burning in fuels and others. So is there any guideline for individuals or individual institutions like my college or my NSET or the SMEs, the small and medium enterprises? Is there any, if you can have any, then please share with me. My other question would be I have some feeling that the efficiency or the per dollar benefit arriving out from disaster risk reduction appears to be, or for the SDG, appears to be way high than the climate change adaptation. And when it talks about mitigation basically is a nation's job, it's a job of the government, largely. But then adaptation is the individual's job. So if there is any good example, Loy, I raised two questions. If there is any good success story or any guidelines how to behave for individual or for individual institution or SMEs. And the second is it fact that the efficiency of disaster risk reduction or for sustainable development goal is way higher than that of climate change adaptation? Or maybe I'm totally wrong.
Yeah, I will have to keep it rather broad at this stage, but I'm happy to provide documents and references later. So if I've understood, your comment is, and I'd actually perhaps disagree when you say that Nepal has done well on sustainable development, because in fact, that is the more gray area and the more difficult area. The targets are ambitious. Some of us may feel they're not ambitious enough, but if you read the detailed 169 targets and the indicators, you will find, in my belief, that it is impossible to achieve by 2030. So having said, no, this is my view, we can debate it out. But so a lot more needs to be done on the SDGs as a whole. Now, on climate, I have read once, and I was trying to find it in the run-up to this preparation, but I could not find the document. There is a Nepal strategy on climate change, and this is adopted by the ministry. So I remember glancing at it. I could not find a copy to read it before we actually hold this talk. So I may not be able to be very specific, but I was impressed by the fact that you have a specific document, because then you can hold the government accountable, and you can also partner with the government to implement what they have committed. So please read it if you haven't read it. Please share with me what you have, because it's a formal, almost legislative agenda, and it's maybe an act or it may be a declaration by a ministry. I can't remember which one it is, but there is a formal document to which government is committed. So please read it, please share it with me, and I will provide additional comments.
Thank you. Thank you. There is Professor D.P. Adhikari who wants to.
One second. I just finish your other two things. So SMEs and what action they can take. There are documents available, and I will try to share some of them with you, and you can pass it on to NGS, or I can talk to Mr. Ananta Prasad, the chair of NEA as well, So please share his email. The point I wanted to make. Yeah. Secondly, you said that adaptation requires work both by individuals and the government. That's what I've understood and what I've noted down. I beg to disagree, in the sense that adaptation requires conscious work to be done by each and every sector. And it is both individual action, it is family action, it is community action, it is city action that needs to be taken. And beyond, the districts also need to take action. So, and private sector needs to take action. Universities need to act. So this is an important agenda. And then there are specific elements of climate within the context of Nepal. And broadly, you have to situate the challenges that Nepal is facing within the economic context, because you are a newly independent nation. You are making bold strides. When I say, anyway.
No, don't say independent.
Not independent. Independent is the wrong word to use, but
Yeah.
You are governing more strongly by elected officials. You have a third elected president or a fourth elected president. So these are important milestones in the history of your nation, and you need to act on them. So I think we need to have a shared document on what action should be taken sectorally, geographically, and by these various levels, and create this document, even by civil society. And this could be something that you can partner with others on doing.
Let's listen
So
to
these are my reactions to what you said.
Professor Adhikari.
Please. You're muted.
You're muted, Professor Adhikari.
Yeah, I'll unmute. Okay. Thank you, Ahmad sir. Thank you. And it's a great pleasure to listen Loy Rego, such a learned person on climate change, sustainable development, and disaster risk management, and so on. And it's a very big topic. Climate change, sustainable development, and you covered all the issues of climate change and sustainable development. Actually, I have not a question, but I want to talk a little bit about my experience. You know, every COP develops new terms. Since the first COP to the 27th, every time there is new term, new issues, new commitment, but as of now, very little has been achieved. As of the least developed countries and developing countries, very little has been done. One example, you know, in Nepal, our Prime Minister has declared that he will have hydrogen-fueled car very soon. That is the development here.
Sorry, I didn't get the last line.
I mean, a lot of information and a lot of literature has been developed in climate and sustainable development field.
Yes, yes.
But little has been achieved. And as you mentioned that, it's very interesting. The world is heading to the path of surrender. You mentioned something, but there is a lot of hope, but still the world is heading to the path of surrender because very little has been achieved in sustainable gold and climate change sector in Nepal, because we are consuming so much resources as if we have several Earths. That is one of the reasons of climate change, and the impacts are everywhere, impacts are everywhere. And one question I want to ask you is that about loss and damage. There is loss and damage. So how can we attribute the loss and damage we have seen these years? Whether there is climate change or not, there are loss and damages since long time. And we are talking about the loss and damage, and the loss and damage are increasing each year worldwide. And then my question is how we can attribute each loss and damage and pay for the loss and damage. I want to hear about this topic.
Loy,
Thank you.
elaborate on the loss and damage. What should be the steps that how should we demand for the compensation for all the loss and damage that Nepal is suffering from, as against these all global frameworks? Is that right?
Yeah, that is right, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, Ajay, let me answer this first, and then I see another written. So I do believe that we have an anchor on which to raise demands, because we are not contributing to global warming as much as we are being impacted by global warming. So Nepal as a country, a less developed, landlocked country, is to some extent protected from the ocean, but also vulnerable to various elements, including earthquake risk, flood risk, GLOF risk, and various other elements, whether they are landslides, whether it's drought in certain areas, riverine floods, floods at a great distance. So there are no dearth of hazards, even if you are protected from cyclones or tornadoes. So the point I'm making is that there is some damage, there is financial, there is loss which has been created by wrong climate action, and we need to fix it. So for example, if you compare Nepal and Bhutan, Bhutan is far more aggressive in dealing with the environment than Nepal. So, and I'm making a judgment here, so don't get me wrong. But we can learn. We can all learn from Bhutan. So, including India. So, coming back to your question on loss and damage, there are various methodologies for assessing it. There are various mechanisms for gathering information, and you need to use that whole series of actions to act and help mobilize an analysis which can then be taken to the next COP. So I would encourage you to join hands with other agencies. You are all professional associations. You need to join hands and create, even if it is a so-called citizens report on loss and damage, and take it to the next COP. So, I mean, 3 months' time, you can take this as a task for NGS to do, along and mobilize others. So you can get a foot in the door in the context of loss and damage. You can also get in the foot in the door in the context of, I think you are still under the list of LDCs, and don't feel bad. So do leverage, because there are well-established mechanisms within the LDC area. So look at the national strategy, look at your role in the LDC fund, look at accessing that LDC funding. And I am a strong believer in voluntary commitments. So please, professionals like yours, professional associations like yours, and people, I know Amod for a long time, I know several of you are coming in at 2 o'clock. I'm deeply appreciating your volunteerism and commitment, and urge you to take this as a portfolio within NGS and prepare some gathering of data within the country. I don't mean hard scientific data, but broad national data, province by province, district by district, and not do elaborate work to begin with, but do a broad sweep work to start with. And you can generate some reports which can then make calls for actions needed. So I would encourage you to take this as a possible step to discuss in your next meeting. So this is the broad comment. I'm sorry for keeping it so broad. I hope it's useful.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, sir.
And I find one more question here. How can net zero and fossil fuel being consumed correlate to adaptation? 1 minute. They're two different. Yeah. Anyway, I'm reading the question as it is. How net zero and fossil fuel
Let me interpret it. Let me interpret it. It is basically net zero concept and the continued consumption of fossil fuel. How do they reconcile? I mean, how can we get the concept of net zero with continued consumption?
You can. Okay, so it's a very simple. I mean, in terms of conceptually, net zero can be achieved when we are using renewable energy. Now, this is not easy to achieve, but if we target increasing the percentage of renewable energy that is produced and consumed in the country, you can reduce fossil fuel consumption.
Okay.
By shifting towards renewables. And you have wind power, you have some elements of solar power, you don't have tidal energy, but you have, mountain river flows.
Many.
Yeah, there are many sources of potential power, and you can develop and strengthen these so-called renewable power systems. So I would encourage you to sketch out that path and then act on it.
Well,
one more question. Yeah, go ahead. I'm listening.
Well, I was just wondering that time is almost coming to 1.5 hours, and many are quitting because of their jobs, and I don't see much queries, much raised hands. So shall we make it a day now, Loy?
Sure. But I've noticed that you liked my comment about creating a small group.
Yes.
I would seriously, I strongly endorse this. So do establish, even if it is a small subcommittee to begin with, to sketch out various things that you could do, and also whom you could collaborate with. So I strongly endorse this.
You will discuss that within the committee. So Loy Rego, you covered, as Professor D.P. Adhikari noted, that you covered a very wide spectrum of issues, both the SDGs and climate change, but still you did very, very well. People understood it better. At least I understood it much better than what I started with this afternoon. So thank you very much, Loy. It was a wonderful experience having you in this meeting, and I thank you very much on my behalf. But then I now hand it over to Lok Vijayji, our Secretary General of Nepal Geological Society, and thank you very much for giving me this.
Shukriya.
Thank you, Amod sir. Thank you, Loy, Dr. Loy, for your wonderful presentation and engagement in the discussion. So in the last, I would like to request the President of Nepal Geological Society, Dr. Ananta Prasad Gajurel, to conclude this webinar with some words. Please, Ananta sir. So you are muted, sir.
Muted. Mike.
Yeah. Thank you very much, General Secretary Dr. Lok Vijay Adhikari. This is a next opportunity to discuss about climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. And I deeply acknowledge Dr. Loy Rego for in-depth discussion on the climate change adaptation and mitigation issues and declarations made by UN and COPE. I thank to all the participants of this webinar series program, and wish to be together in future that will be announced by our scientific organizing committee. I really deeply acknowledge to Professor Dr. Amod Mari Dixit, who has been actively organizing this kind of knowledge distribution in our society, in our group, using Zoom platform. Thank you very much. I conclude the end of this seminar program. Thank you.
Thank you. Shukriya.
Okay. Namaste. Lok Vijay ji.
हजुर सर
यो के छ, यो स्लाइड्सहरु अभाइलेबल छ, यसो शेयर गर्दा ठिकै हुन्थ्यो कि? धेरै कुरा कभर गर्नु भएको छ।
स्लाइडलाई सो आमा सर एकचोटि भनिदिनुहुन्छ कि?
हुन्छ म भन्दिन्छु। Loy Rego has asked me to convey to the audience that he would be happy. He said that just sharing the slide will be not that beneficial. He wants to enter into conversation with the people. So he wants to have communication, and then he has requested me to ask whoever wants to communicate to him directly. So Loy, we will be sharing your
contact.
L Rego.
Okay.
No.
Right.
Yeah. LREGO.
No.
No. What is that? Can you please?
No. Two comments. One is my email. I will write over here.
Please
so
do
the
write.
email is Regoloy.
Regoloy, yes. Regoloy, L-O-Y. Regoloy at
gmail.com. So just
gmail.com. That's very easy.
Let me see it.
And then this name. So Regoloy at gmail.com.
Yes.
That is for it is for everyone. Yes. So please contact Loy Rego at Rego Loy for further discussion and the slides and other materials. Good.
I'm happy to share. I have made some small modifications in the slides. So I'm happy to share a PDF version of it.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
But I have already made some modifications based on which are different from what you have screened today. But I'm happy to share that. So let me do it. I will send it to Amodji. He can forward it to others. And further questions that you have, you're more than welcome to write to me.
Okay.
And preferably copy NGS. Yeah. And I'm happy to remain engaged.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, please. So that ends the bravest are braving the time. Thank you very much. I must acknowledge here the previous Director General, Dr. Soma Sapkota ji. I see here the presence of our Deputy Executive Deputy DDG, Deputy DG of Department of Mines and Geology, Madam Jha, and Dhruva Thapa ji. You know, these are all very senior people. Savilal Pokhrel ji, very senior people, and these are the movers and shakers of this country, Loy. So the message has found its place in the heart and minds of many Nepalese professionals. This is, you know, we Nepalese professionals, we geologists, Geological Society is one of the oldest, and you may be knowing about it, one of the oldest professional societies, and continuously we have got very high standard quality journal published regularly without any interruption, even during the COVID days, I must say, and that accompanies with a more, you know, a more awareness type of what we call the bulletin that carries the advertisements. The journal doesn't carry any advertisement, and it's very pristine sort of a scientific this thing. It comes in quite a significant volume. So and then it had a glorious, you know, tradition of hosting international, you know, meeting on aspect of geological sciences every 2 years, and a national workshop or national conference annually. So that is the glory of Nepal Geological Society. And now thank you. I mean, although your topic is a little bit away from the mainstream geology or sciences problems of Nepal, but then that's the fun that we are now, you know, crossing the silos and getting to know each other and across transdisciplinary concept development. So that's where we are. And thank you very much. We keep in touch with you, Loy. You have been a good friend of Nepal, and we'll keep in touch.
Yeah, I had a question.
To me?
No. To everybody. That I will send up the summary of the not summary, PDF of the revised slides. So that I commit to do, and you continue discussing and let me know when you take any decision. Even it can, you know, I targeted COP28, but there is unfortunately or fortunately a COP29 as well. So you can take your time, but no, I want to once again come back to, there are two different approaches taken by the Sendai framework and SDGs, which is you enact a document and let it last for 15 years. And an approach taken by the climate change, which I used to be critical of, but having participated and getting to know them better over the last 5 years, I see the strength of this current approach and the higher levels of engagement from the government, which results as a result. So let us not discount it, and let us work using both approaches. The voluntary commitments will continue to remain important, and I would urge.
Absolutely, Loy. But nonetheless, what we see is that the climate action, mitigation as well as the adaptation, it seems that it remains the luxury of those who participate in these COPs and all these climate meetings, whereas the disaster reduction has become a mainstay with the people. That is the difference. We don't see climate action at the level of people, except what they have been used to be doing, depending upon their traditional wisdom. So the world has not changed for the people in terms of climate action as against the DPRR that people have. It is almost like mainstreamed at the local level. That's the situation in Nepal. I would say that I'm very happy at DPRR rather than at climate action in Nepal.
Okay.
with
I will just offer one small input. One small input. There is something called the Climate Action Network.
Yeah.
This is an NGO,
Mhm.
and which is worldwide, as well as it has sub-regional branches. So there is certainly a Climate Action Network, South Asia. I don't know whether you have a Climate Action Network, Nepal, but I would urge you to uncover that. I will help introduce you to Sanjay Vashisht. That is the name of the guy who is handling South Asia coordination, South Asia. And if you are interested in establishing a climate action network, Nepal, it's something you could talk to him about. And maybe it already exists and we simply don't know about it. So climate action is needed, and if it's not established, we need to establish it. So let's take climate action and build a build a network of professional associations, including the Geological Association, to help tackle climate change in the context of Nepal. That's my broad suggestion. What it means in detail, we can work out through email. Okay, I think I've taken enough of your time.
Dr. Loy, just I have one small request to you.
Please.
If possible, can you provide a small abstract of your talk, today's talk? Because we publish it in our regular bulletin, yearly bulletin, with the activities, so that we can publish it with your abstract.
How you give me
half page? No. So it's up to you.
I have I will just show you.
Words, 300 words, 500 words, 600 words. Yeah, more than 300 words.
I
is okay,
unfortunately got an 18-page document, which I
that's
have
too big,
reduced to
that's too
slides.
big.
No.
250 to 500, 200 to 500.
I know. So I will have to work on it. So I commit to doing it, but push me, because
So
unfortunately I make other commitments as well.
I will
So
remind
push
you.
me,
In coming days,
I will 300 to 500 words.
Okay.
So let us informally.
Okay. In principle, yes. Yeah. Okay.
Your permission, I need to go and I say goodbye.
Yeah. Don't worry.
Okay.
Bye,
So
namaste.
let's meet in
Pleasure.
another time. Yeah, soon. Namaste.